As far as possible, he left the day-to-day siege of Mantua to Serriere. In Milan, he moved his military headquarters from the Palazzo Serbelloni to the Villa Crivelli at Mamello outside the city, where it was said that a vast throng of army officers, administrators, contractors and lobbyists could always be found in a huge marquee he had set up in the gardens. He never really cared for the Serbelloni palace but spent his time with Josephine there. Under her influence, he began to cut a quasi-imperial dash, dining in public or parading with an escort of 300 red-uniformed lancers. Josephine relished the imperial style, but at first the Milanese burghers found her hard to take and the manners of her entourage outrageous. Particular offense was given by the Marchesa of Visconti, who doubled as Josephine's lady-in-waiting and Berthier's mistress, but soon it became chic to ape the easygoing hedonism of the Josephine circle. Even as the new Milanese elite followed her into sensualism, they deluged her with presents on the understanding that she would get her husband to stop the looting. When he was away from Milan, Napoleon chafed at the separations. The love letters recommenced and were just as impassioned as before. From Lake Garda, where he was conferring with Serriere, he wrote on the 18th of July, "I have been in Virgil's village, by the lake side, in the silver light of the moon, and not a single second without thinking of Josephine." That he was suspicious of her is clear from the many exhortations to marital fidelity, and his disgust for the illicit pleasures of the flesh. When his officers consorted with prostitutes and caught venereal disease, he wrote, "Good God, what women! What morals! Tell my brother Joseph to be faithful to his Julie." At the end of July there was a reunion in Brescia. Napoleon wrote that the tenderest of lovers awaits you. Since this was where Hippolyte Charles was based, the presumption must be that Josephine agreed to meet Napoleon there rather than elsewhere because of the presence of the Reich Hussar. But Napoleon's planned idyll was cut short by the sudden advance of a new Austrian army down the Brenner Pass. He sent Josephine back to Milan with Junot and the dragoons by a circuitous route. When Josephine heard of Napoleon's success against this new army, which made it safe to return to Brescia, she sped back to the city. Napoleon's headquarters was just 25 miles away, and she found an urgent appeal from him to join him there. Pleading exhaustion, she spent the night with Hippolyte Charles instead. Her biographers have predictably had fun with the dramatic irony about the tenderest of lovers who awaited Josephine in Brescia. It was the 29th of July when Napoleon got definite news that an Austrian counter-offensive was underway. From then until February 1797 a titanic struggle took place for the besieged Mantua, and the other three fortresses, Peschiera, Verona and Legnago, which formed the famous quadrilateral on the southern tip of Lake Garda, guarding the entrances to the Lombardy plain from the Brenner Pass, and the Alps. Since Mantua was so bitterly fought over, it has acquired a symbolic importance in the Napoleonic story, but it was not Mantua itself Napoleon was interested in, but control of the routes to and from the Tyrol. The new Austrian army was commanded by Count Dagobert Wurmser, who had been detached from the Rhine with 25,000 to reinforce Beaulieu. The combined army of men made rendezvous at Trent and marched on Mantua in 3 columns, the right via Chiesa, the center converging on Montebaldo between the Adige Valley and Lake Garda, and the left through the Adige Valley itself. The Austrians scored some early successes, leaving Napoleon temporarily despondent, and took Lonato on the 31st of July. But Wurmser made the cardinal error of concentrating on the relief of Mantua instead of uniting the 3 wings of his army. This allowed Napoleon to indulge his favorite strategy of the center position, where a numerically inferior army got between 2 sections of a superior army to defeat them piecemeal. Napoleon threw the enemy out of Lonato with heavy losses on the 3rd of August. 3 divisions of the Austrian right and part of the center were forced to surrender. Wurmser then belatedly moved to support his right but was caught at Castiglione before his left could come up. In a tough, brutal action, which Napoleon always considered Augereau's finest hour, he punctured the Austrian center at Castiglione, while Napoleon routed the left wing. Because of Wurmser's blunders, Napoleon had been able to achieve local superiority of 27,000 against 1,000. The Lake Garda region had seen a week of hard fighting, including the mopping up operations until the 12th of August. The French inflicted 25,000 casualties and took 15,000 prisoners, 9 standards and 70 pieces of cannon. On their own side they lost 000 wounded, 600 dead and 400 prisoners. On the other hand, Wurmser's advance had forced Napoleon to break off the investment of Mantua, losing 179 guns in the process, including all his heavy artillery. Wurmser could now do little for Mantua. After leaving 2 fresh brigades in the city, he returned to Trent to lick his wounds. Napoleon resumed the siege but, without the big guns, the blockade was less effective than before. Hearing of the victories, and mistakenly thinking Murat was achieving similar results on the Rhine, the Directory ordered Napoleon to pursue Wurmser and attempt the link with Murat which they had previously vetoed. Napoleon ignored the Directory's orders. Even if he had wanted to collaborate with Moreau, the idea was chimerical as there was no secret code allowing the two commanders to communicate. Besides, his men were exhausted and in need of rest and recreation, and he could scarcely advance to the Brenner Pass with Mantua still in his rear. Even more seriously, he could not leave behind an unpacified Italy. The clashes with Wurmser had been politically valuable to him, since at first there were rumors of French defeats, which encouraged Napoleon's enemies within Italy to come out from the woodwork. The pattern of loyalties was now reasonably clear. Milan, Lombardy, Parma, Bologna, Ferrara and Reggio had kept faith with him, but Modena, Cremona, Pavia and the Papal States had thrown off the mask and revealed their pro-Austrian sentiments. Bearing all this in mind, Napoleon proceeded cautiously. A game of wits developed between him and Wurmser. Napoleon began by leading 33,000 French troops against Wurmser. After a victory at Rovereto, he took Trent on the 4th of September, but Wurmser outwitted him by heading south for Mantua via the Brenta Valley. The object was to force Napoleon back down the Adige Valley to meet this new threat to Mantua, but Napoleon proceeded to trump Wurmser's ace. He did not retrace his steps but simply blocked the gorges north of Trent, and set off south after the Austrians, taking the same pass Wurmser was using. This was a calculated risk. Napoleon was hoping to live off the land without actually knowing that Wurmser's army had left enough to subsist on. On the other hand, Wurmser could not relieve Mantua, since he would be forced either to turn and give battle or to retreat to the Adriatic. Napoleon caught up with the Austrians at Bassano on the 8th of September and inflicted another defeat, ably supported by Augereau on the left and Messina on the right. To his annoyance, however, Wurmser did not, as expected, veer off towards Trieste and the Adriatic but kept on for Mantua. Beating off his pursuers, he crashed through the besieging perimeter around Mantua on the 12th of September and entered the city, raising the total strength of the defense to 23,000 men. When the pursuers joined forces with the besiegers, heavy fighting took place in the suburbs, following which the Austrians were penned inside the old city. The accession of Wurmser seemed to make the fortress impregnable, but in fact the arrival of so many more mouths to feed placed a terrible burden on Mantua's food supply. By Christmas 1796 the defenders were eating horseflesh, and dying at the rate of 150 men a day from malnutrition and disease. Scarcely had he blocked up Wurmser inside Mantua than bad news came in from the German front. On the 24th of August Archduke Charles defeated Jourdan. Moreau fell back before the Austrians and by the beginning of October was back on the west bank of the Rhine. Napoleon always thought that Moreau's 1796 campaign in Germany was a textbook illustration of all the errors he himself had avoided in Italy. Moreau had divided his army and left the flanks unprotected, so that with 3 different corps it was vulnerable to 6 different flank attacks. Moreover, he had left the 2 great fortresses of Philipsburg and Mannheim in his rear without blockading them. Bonaparte did not intend to make the same mistake with Mantua, but his position was potentially troublesome. He had to keep the pressure on Mantua while guarding the northern passes against a surprise Austrian attack, and at the same time had to have one eye open for possible internal revolts in Italy, very likely as the Directory's demand for official exactions was compounded by the private looting and pillaging by the troops, and all this at a time when Moreau's retreat meant the Austrians were certain to make a massive effort on the Italian front. Mid-September saw Napoleon back in Milan and again enjoying Josephine's embraces. Antoine Hamelin, the financier who had accompanied Josephine to Italy, reported that Napoleon could scarcely keep his hands off his wife. He would often caress her passionately and coarsely in the presence of others, embarrassing Hamelin to the point where he would pretend to look out of the window. In her letters to friends in Paris, Josephine rarely mentioned her husband except to disparage him or claim that she was bored. In her letters to Barras she used the name of Bonaparte as power play. She missed her children, she hankered for the pleasures of Paris, and the power broking with Barras, and found the limelight in Italy poor consolation. Napoleon meanwhile played the role of imperial proconsul impressively. His family came to visit him in Mamello, all but Lucian, who still remained aloof. Caroline and Jerome came to Milan for their school holidays, while the most prominent man from the clan was Fesch, wheeling and dealing in army supplies. Napoleon was mightily displeased with Lucian and actually complained about him to Carnot in August, suggesting he be sent to the front with the army of the north to end his troublemaking. But the favored Louis he recommended to Carnot, and the Minister of War was so impressed that he promoted him to captain. On the political front, Napoleon compelled Genoa to accept a French garrison, occupied pro-Austrian Modena and tried to browbeat Venice. A treaty signed with Naples on October nipped in the bud a papal intrigue to put 30,000 Neapolitans into the field against the French. Meanwhile, in the teeth of determined vested interests, he tried to advance his project for a northern Italian republic. He set up 3 interim republics, the Cisalpine, incorporating Milan, the Cispadane linking Modena and Reggio, and the Transpadane, Uniton Ferrara, but always his eye was on the Brenner Pass, waiting for the Austrian offensive that was bound to come now that Moreau had failed so dismally in Germany. In November the Austrians began their campaign. Two armies descended on Italy. One, 28,000 strong, was commanded by Joseph Alvinzi and advanced over the Venetian plain through Vicenza towards Verona. The other, under Davidovich, contained 18,000 troops and debouched in the Adige Valley. The strategy was for Alvinzi's army to feint towards Mantua while Davidovich took Trent. Napoleon's response was to attack Alvinzi while General Vaubois dealt with Davidovich. Unfortunately, Vaubois was badly beaten outside Trent and was forced to retreat in confusion. Napoleon himself was forced out of Verona and was now in great peril. His forces were dispersed, 14,000 men were on the sick list and he had only 10,000 effectives to meet Alvinzi. If the Alvinzi and Davidovich armies now combined, and Wurmser sortied from Mantua to link with them, the French position would be hopeless. This was Napoleon's darkest hour in the entire Italian campaign. His pleas to the Directory for reinforcements had produced just 12 battalions. The War Ministry preferred to waste its resources on the incompetent Moreau in Germany, whose failure had unleashed Alvinzi in the first place. Morale was low in the army of Italy, with a prevailing feeling that, whatever efforts the men made and however many victories they won, they would still be let down by the army of the north, so that more and more Austrian reinforcements poured in. It was in this condition, outnumbered and demoralized, that Napoleon and his army sustained a definite defeat at Alvinzi's hands on the 12th of November, at Caldiro, outside Verona. Next day he wrote despondently to the Directory, "Perhaps we are on the verge of losing Italy. None of the expected help has arrived. I despair of being able to avoid raising the siege of Mantua, which would have been ours within a week. In a few days we will make a last effort. If fortune smiles, Mantua will be taken and with it Italy." Napoleon decided to concentrate on Alvinzi, before the Austrian finally realized the obvious and coordinated effectively with Wurmser and Davidovich. He opted for a daring flank march to cross the Adige south of Verona, and strike Alvinzi in the rear. Unfortunately, he ran into a strong Croat detachment defending the village, and bridge Croats called up reinforcements, as did the French, and a 3-day slugging battle commenced in the marshes, ditches and dikes around the bridge. Arcola was Lodi all over again, with the same terrible loss of life from frontal attacks by the French unprepared positions, but this time Napoleon did try to lead his men across the bridge in a do-or-die effort. He describes his efforts as follows: "I determined to try a last effort in person. I seized a flag, rushed on the bridge, and there planted it. The column I commanded had reached the middle of the bridge, when the flashing fire and the arrival of a division of the enemy frustrated the attack. The grenadiers at the head of the column, finding themselves abandoned by the rear, hesitated, but being hurried away in the flight, they persisted in keeping possession of their general. They seized me by the arm and by my clothes and dragged me along with them amidst the dead, dying and the smoke. I was precipitated in a morass, in which I sank up to the middle, surrounded by the enemy. The grenadiers perceived that their general was in danger. A cry was heard of 'Forward, soldiers, to save the general.' The brave men immediately turned back, ran upon the enemy, drove him beyond the bridge, and I was saved." Such, at any rate, is the account of Napoleon the mythmaker. Louis claimed that his brother seized the tricolor to lead the charge but fell into a dike as he ran along the causeway through the marshes towards the bridge, and would have drowned had not he pulled him out. The version of his aide, the Polish officer Sulkowski, has a more authentic ring of truth. He described Napoleon raising the standard on the bridge and then berating his men for cowardice. This is borne out by Napoleon's report to the Directory on the 19th of November, where he admits, almost in throwaway fashion, "We had to give up the idea of taking the village by frontal assault. What happened was that he threw a pontoon bridge across the Adige farther downstream at Alberto, and was then able to attack the Austrian rear over firm ground. Alvinzi then retreated, even though his position in point of supplies and reinforcements was superior to Bonaparte's. Napoleon had been lucky, his nerve held better than Alvinzi's. But the upshot was certainly favorable to Napoleon. Alvinzi took 7,000 casualties as against 4,500 for the French, and could no longer link up with Davidovich. Napoleon next turned his attention to Davidovich, who had beaten Vaubois in every encounter. But it was not until the 17th of November that he began his campaign in earnest. Had he done so 2 days earlier, Napoleon would again have been severely defeated. As it was, Davidovich himself came within an ace of being encircled by Napoleon's victorious army. Another 3 days of French successes followed around Ronco, in which Davidovich took heavy casualties. Both he and Alvinzi retreated northward. Once again the Austrians had failed to relieve Mantua. The French army, which had quit Verona by the Milan Gate when Alvinzi approached, re-entered it 3 days later in triumph by the Venice Gate. Napoleon won the Arcole campaign by the narrowest of margins. He made a grave mistake in getting bogged down around Arcole and should have found the Alberto crossing advancing much earlier. Alvinzi should have destroyed him in the swamps and Davidovich should have struck earlier. Louis Bonaparte reported that French morale was near cracking point, the troops are no longer the same, and shout loudly for peace. Even Bonaparte's admirers concede that Arcole was a near-run thing. The great German military theorist Karl von Clausewitz thought that Napoleon won because of superior tactics, greater boldness, mastery of the strategic defensive and, ultimately, because of his superior mind. Yet the crucial factor was his nerve. In an eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation, Alvinzi blinked first. Even though Napoleon did not achieve encirclement and decisive victory, his protean abilities depressed the Austrian government, who began to sue for peace at the end of November. But talks broke down over Austrian insistence that they be allowed to reprovision Mantua. Napoleon wrote to Josephine in euphoria about his latest victory, but 2 days later his thoughts had turned to erotica. How happy I would be if I could be present at your undressing, the little firm white breast, the adorable face, the hair tied up in a scarf à Creole. You know that I never forget the little visits, you know, the little black forest. I kiss it 1,000 times and wait impatiently for the moment I will be in it. 6 days later, on the 27th of November, he arrived at the Serbelloni Palace, eager for another encounter with the Black Forest. But Josephine had used the pretext of her husband's preoccupation with the military campaign to go to Genoa, where she found solace in the arms of Hippolyte Charles. So devastated was Napoleon to find Josephine absent that he almost fainted with shock on the spot. Later that day, as he got out of his hot bath, he suffered something akin to an epileptic fit. In the 9 days he waited for her to return, he sent her 3 letters that oscillated between rage and lust. I left everything to see you, to hold you in my arms. The pain I feel is incalculable. I don't want you to change any plans for parties, or to be interested in the happiness of a man who lives only for you. I am not worth it. When I beg you to equal a love like mine, I am wrong. Why should I expect lace to weigh as much as gold? 0 Josephine. Josephine finally returned from Genoa on the 7th of December and 3 days later gave a grand ball in the Palazzo Serbelloni. But by now Napoleon had political problems to handle. The parting of the ways had finally come with his old friend Salisti, the Directory's political representative. He and his colleague Guérin looted one church too many and went too far in selling the proceeds openly on the street. When Napoleon clamped down, Salisti wrote a poisonous letter to Paris, stressing Bonaparte's overweening ambition, his high-handed unilateral conclusion of peace terms with Piedmont in May, the refusal to accept a joint command with Kellerman, and much else. The Directory in some alarm sent General Henry Clark to Italy as its special representative, charged with making a detailed report on the situation there. The initial contacts between Napoleon and Clark were scarcely propitious. Clark arrived in Milan on the 29th of November, the day after the bombshell discovery that Josephine was in Genoa. Napoleon was in a foul temper and Clark reported that he looked emaciated and cadaverous, having picked up fever, probably in the ditches of Arcole. Napoleon remarked snappishly that he was opposed to an armistice with Austria. Clark snapped back, "That is the intention of the Directory and there's an end of it." But 3 days later, after minute investigation, Clark changed tack and admitted that Napoleon was right. On the 7th of December, when Josephine arrived, he was ready to pen the following highly favorable report to Barras and Carnot. "Everyone here regards him as a man of genius. He is feared, loved and respected in Italy. I believe he is attached to the Republic and without any ambition save to retain the reputation he has won. General Bonaparte is not without defects. Sometimes he is hard, impatient, abrupt or imperious. Often he demands difficult things in too hasty a manner. He has not been respectful enough towards the government commissioners. When I reproved him for this, he replied that he could not possibly treat otherwise men who were universally scorned for their immorality and incapacity. Salisti has the reputation of being the most shameless rogue in the army and Guérin is inefficient, neither is suitable for the army of Italy." Whatever their misgivings, the directors had to admit that their suspicions of Bonaparte could not be sustained. They promised him full support and gave him virtual carte blanche in Italy, psychologically of the greatest importance, for in January 1797 the Austrians exerted themselves for one final effort to wrest the peninsula from the French grasp. As a result of a nationwide recruiting campaign in Austria, Alvinzi was able to put 70,000 troops in the field. It was fortunate for Napoleon that the Directory finally made good their promise to send reinforcements to the army of Italy. Napoleon reorganized his forces so as to put them in 5 different divisions, led by Generals Massena, Augereau, Ray, Serrurier and Joubert. The success story of this part of the campaign was Barthélemy Joubert, who had replaced the disgraced Vaubois in November 1, 796. Tall and thin, with a weak constitution which he strengthened by deliberate hardship, Joubert was intrepid, vigilant and active, the perfect complement to Massena. It was on these two most of all that Napoleon relied when Alvinzi launched his offensive in January 1797, this time aiming at Rivoli between the River Adige and Lake Garda, with diversionary attacks from Bassano and Padua. Napoleon waited at Verona to make sure he knew where the weight of the attack would fall. Joubert's division came under heavy pressure at Rivoli, so on the 13th of January Napoleon decided to ignore the supplementary offensives and concentrate his forces there. He arrived on the plateau of Rivoli at 1 a.m. on the 14th of January, and attacked at dawn, at first running into stiff resistance and once almost being outflanked. But he timed the playing of his trump card perfectly. Messina completed another of the grueling night marches that were becoming legendary on this campaign, and covered the 15 miles to the Platea of Rivoli by dawn, marching on a fine moonlit night but sloshing through snow and ice. Alvinzi had nearly succeeded in outflanking Joubert, even though he had thereby separated his infantry from his cavalry. The arrival of Messina transformed the situation. The Austrians were blasted off the outflanking positions on two hills, then Messina ruptured the Austrian center. Next Joubert's men counter-attacked to recover ground already lost, but the Austrians bitterly contested every inch of ground, and Napoleon had several horses shot under him during the day. At dusk on the 14th of January Napoleon and Messina left the scene to intercept another Austrian army trying to relieve Mantua. At Rivoli Joubert won another victory next day. Total Austrian losses on the 2 days were 14,000 as against 180 French casualties. Messina's division, meanwhile, performing prodigies, marched another 30 miles to catch up with General Provera, who was bearing down on Serrurier and the besiegers of Mantua after giving Augereau the slip. On the 16th of January the French completely defeated Provera at La Favorita. 7,000 Austrians and 22 guns were captured. Mantua, with its garrison at starvation point, now sued for terms. Bonaparte acclaimed Messina in front of his troops as the child of victory. In 5 days 48,000 Austrians on the offensive had been reduced to a rabble of 1,000 fugitives. Wurmser sent an aide to negotiate with Napoleon and tried to secure decent terms by claiming that there was still a 12-month supply of food in Mantua. Napoleon, in a typical jape, hovered round the negotiations in disguise. Only when he finally sat down and wrote his terms on the margins of Wurmser's draft proposals did the Austrian envoy realize who he was. Overcome by the generosity of the terms, the envoy then blurted out that they had just 3 days' food left. However magnanimous Napoleon was in victory, he could not accept that Wurmser was in any sense his equal, and made a point of being absent when the Austrian commander came to sign the surrender terms with Serrurier. Mantua opened its gates to the French on the 2nd of February. No military obstacle now remained to the invasion of Austria via the Brenner Pass and the Tyrol. Yet the Directory insisted that before Napoleon gave the Austrians the coup de grace, he had to settle accounts with the Pope, who had refused to sign a treaty with France in the belief that Austrian military power would prevail. Early in February Napoleon led his army on a sweep through the Papal States, subduing successively Bologna, Faenza, Forli, Rimini, Macerata and Ancona. At Ancona he already evinced clear signs of the Oriental complex that was to be so striking a feature of the irrational side of his political projects. On the 10th of February he wrote to the Directory, "The port of Ancona is the only Adriatic port of importance, after Venice. From any point of view it is essential for our links with Constantinople. In 24 hours one can be in Macedonia. It does not require brilliant insight to see that it was Macedonia's greatest hero, Alexander the Great, who was on his mind as he wrote." By the time Napoleon reached Ancona on the 10th of February, Pius VI was ready to come to terms. By the Treaty of Tolentino, the Pope ceded Bologna, Ferrara and the Romagna and paid an indemnity of 30 millions. Napoleon accepted this, even though atheistic firebrands in the Directory, like Louis Le Revelier Lepo, wanted Pius deposed. Napoleon reasoned, and argued thus to the Directory, that the deposition of the Pope would not serve French interests. The papacy was a stabilizing factor in central Italy and, if it was removed, the power vacuum would be filled by Naples, then an even more embittered enemy of France than Rome was. He was also mindful of the likely consequence that he would ignite a second Vendée or religious war in Italy if he pressed the Pope too hard. The invasion of Austria would then be delayed indefinitely, making the obvious contrast between French failures on the Rhine and the spectacular successes achieved by Bonaparte in Italy. The Directory decided to concentrate on the Italian soft underbelly approach to Austria. They reinforced Napoleon to a strength of 8,000 by sending him the divisions of Generals Bernadotte and Delmas, who had previously been operating in Germany. The arrival of Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte signaled the advent in Napoleon's life of one of the 3 most bitter and devious enemies he would ever encounter in his career. Bernadotte's fundamental problem was that his proper mark was as a second-rate regimental colonel, yet he considered himself a genius. Tall, immaculately dressed, a vainglorious genius of the mouth who put new meaning into the term gasconade. Bernadotte was born in Pau, joined the army at 17 and worked his way up through the ranks, rising rapidly on the great surge of revolutionary promotions. An opportunist and adventurer who masked his egomania beneath a profession of extreme Jacobin principles, Bernadotte was promoted to general in 1794 at the age of 31, in the very year that his close associate Saint just perished on the guillotine. Nothing better illustrated the vulpine nature of the man who outdid his fellow Gascon, La Fontaine's fox, in humbug. During the Rhine campaign of 1796, Bernadotte threatened to burn the German university town of Altdorf to the ground when the academics objected to his troops' rape and pillaging. A notable hothead, Bernadotte once fought a duel with his own chief of staff and, when the Altdorf incident was reported in the Paris press, asked the directors to imprison the offending editor. When they demurred, Bernadotte fumed that his honor had been impugned and was prevented from throwing up his command only by the shrewd advice of his friend and fellow Jacobin General Kleber. Bernadotte had barely set foot on Italian soil than he was at odds with Napoleon's indispensable chief of staff, Berthier. Bernadotte's ability to start a row in an empty room can perhaps be inferred from the trivial pretext he used to challenge Berthier to a duel. Berthier addressed all generals as Monsieur, but the Jacobin firebrand Bernadotte insisted that the only proper form of greeting was citoyen. Napoleon had to intervene to compose this storm in a teacup. Predictably, the first meeting between Napoleon himself and Bernadotte was scarcely propitious. Bernadotte thought, on no grounds whatever, that he was a superior military talent to Bonaparte and should be commanding the army of Italy. When Napoleon overawed him as he had overawed Augereau and Messina, the sulky Bernadotte grumbled to his cronies, "Over there I saw a man of 26 or 27 who wants to appear 50. It bodes no good for the Republic." Napoleon ordered Bernadotte to commence the offensive on Row March with the vanguard off the right. The Gascon general crossed the Tagliamento and Isonzo rivers but complained when he was sent to besiege the Austrian fortress of Gradisca. His paranoia was well to the fore in this open lament to his senior officers, "I see it all. Bonaparte is jealous of me and wants to disgrace me. I have no resource left but to blow my brains out. If I blockade Gradisca I shall be blamed for not having stormed it. If I storm it I shall be told I ought to have blockaded it." Napoleon's offensive was a great success. After taking meticulous precautions against a possible Austrian attack, he sent Joubert through the Brenner Pass, and himself swept Archduke Charles aside at the Tagliamento and took Klagenfurt on the 29th of March. Murat was supposed to be coordinating movements on the Rhine but did not stir. Napoleon suspected that the Directory, fearful of the suspect loyalty of the army of Italy and its commander, had given secret instructions to Murat not to move a muscle. Realizing that he could not hope to take Vienna unaided, Napoleon decided on a bluff. He advanced as far as Lieben, just 7 to 5 miles from Vienna, and then offered a truce. The Austrians agreed a 5-day cessation of hostilities, while Napoleon, who was stalling, tried to learn Murat's intentions. Confused and suspicious about the actions and motives of the Directory, Napoleon then decided to take a further gamble. He actually proposed a full set of peace terms and gave the Austrians until the 8th of April to accept. This was high-risk poker playing, for if the Austrians turned him down and Murat did not open his offensive, his bluff would be called spectacularly. The peace terms were, however, very generous. Austria was to cede Belgium to France, allow her to occupy the left bank of the Rhine and the Ionian Islands, and also recognize Bonaparte's new Cisalpine Republic of Milan, Bologna and Modena. Austria would be allowed to keep a foothold in Italy by retaining the territories of Istria, Dalmatia and Friaul. A day before the peace offer was due to expire, the Austrians conceded defeat, heavily influenced by the urgings of their best general, Archduke Charles. Preliminaries of peace were signed at Lieben on 8 April. To his fury, Napoleon then learned that 2 days earlier Murat had finally crossed the Rhine. In composed mood he later wrote, "I was playing vingt et un and I stopped at 20, but at the time he was angry with the Directory for what he considered a calculated double cross." As a sweetener to get Austria to accept the Lieben terms, Napoleon had included a secret clause promising that the Habsburg Empire could swallow up the Republic of Venice. Since Napoleon was master of Italy, it now remained for him to make the gift-wrapped presentation of the most serene republic. Napoleon was never more Machiavellian than in his treatment of Venice in 797. He had long been angered by a so-called Venetian neutrality that actually benefited Austria, and was well aware that the oligarchs of Venice detested the French Revolution and its principles. He also realized that it was pointless to consult the Directory. At best they would equivocate and at worst actively intrigue against him. On the other hand, a direct attack on Venice might suck the army of Italy into a prolonged siege, since the Republic could easily be reinforced and provisioned by sea, and any sort of sustained defense would give the rest of conquered Italy dangerous ideas about resisting the French invader. Fortunately for Napoleon, the Venetians played into his hands. When Napoleon paused at Klagenfurt, false rumors reached Italy that the French had received a military check. In Verona, the people rose and massacred a French garrison. In this action they were warmly encouraged by the Doge and his ministers. But when the Veronese heard that the Austrians had accepted French peace terms, their nerve cracked and they threw in the towel. Napoleon sent the faithful Junot to Venice to read a grave and thunderous letter to the Senate. Too late, the Venetian oligarchy realized it had jumped the gun by supporting Verona. Panic-stricken, the Doge exerted all his power to lobby, bribe and cajole the directors in Paris into ordering Napoleon to leave Venice well alone. But Bonaparte had foreseen this reaction and was able to find excuses, based on technicalities, for ignoring the Directory's instructions about Venice. On the 3rd of May, Napoleon sent his troops into the water-bound Republic. Deprived of any possibility of succor from Austria, the demoralized oligarchy resigned and handed power to the democratic faction that had allowed the French into the city. The French looting of Italy reached new heights even by the rapacious standards of the Army of Italy. Among the myriad treasures to be removed from the city and sent back to Paris were the treasures of the arsenal, the Lion of Venice and the 4 bronze horses of St. Mark's. The final stage of Napoleon's settling accounts with Venice came on the 26th of May when he sent his troops to occupy the Ionian islands of Cephalonia, Corfu, and Zante. There was no opposition. Napoleon told his commander to show outward deference to Venetian authority, but keep real control in his own hands. Once again he showed himself to be a master of cynical propaganda. If the inhabitants should prove to be inclined towards independence, you are to encourage that inclination, and in proclamations you will be issuing you must not omit to speak of Greece, Sparta and Athens. It was typical of his independence and high-handedness that he did not bother to notify the Directory of the occupation of the islands until the beginning of August. By June 1797 Napoleon was back in Milan. This time he moved his court and family from the Palazzo Serbelloni to the Baroque palace of Mamello outside the city. Josephine, who had not been able to effect a meeting with Hippolyte Charles since December, told Napoleon she needed to return to Paris for her health. But the mysterious malady cleared up miraculously once she heard that among the guard of honor at Mamello that summer would be the bold Chevalier Charles. There was no longer any talk of returning to Paris. Charles was aide-de-camp to General Victor Emmanuel Leclerc, son of a rich Pontoise miller and one of the Toulon set whose mere presence at the siege meant they were automatic favorites with Bonaparte. When Napoleon returned to Milan, one of his first actions was to uncover a potential family scandal. Roaming the Montebello palace one day, he came upon Leclerc making love to his sexually overcharged sister Pauline, already a stunning beauty of fabled lubricious charms. Napoleon insisted that the pair get married at once, and by chance was able to arrange a double family wedding. The shrewish, sour-faced and mannish Maria Anna Bonaparte, who had taken the name Elissa, was marrying the extremely stupid Corsican aristocrat Pasquale Baxiacchi, with all her family present. Napoleon presided over a double ceremony on the 14th of June in the oratory of St. Francis. He had, as he thought, solved the problem of Pauline's voracious sexual appetite. With hindsight we can appreciate the irony whereby Leclerc serviced one Bonaparte nymphomaniac, while his aide attended to another. The double family wedding in Milan on the 14th of June saw the entire Bonaparte clan face to face with Josephine for the first time. Predictably, perhaps, there was no love lost. The Bonapartes could not understand why Napoleon was so complacent about his wife's love affairs and her spendthrift ways, which meant spending their money. There was particular animus between Josephine and Pauline, who tried to mete out a family revenge by setting her cap at Hippolyte Charles. The cynical Hussar made history by being the only man known to have resisted Pauline's charms. Letizia also detested Josephine, but her ill feelings were assuaged with the prospect of a triumph she enjoyed the following month. The French had finally cleared the English out of Corsica and winnowed out all the fervent Paulistas. Armed with 10,000 francs compensation from the Directory, Letizia returned to Ajaccio and set about restoring and redecorating the Casa Buonaparte. Now at last she was a woman of substance, and her second son was, potentially if not actually, the most powerful man in France.